For the second practice here, we're gonna be using at least 2 different watercolor techniques. You'll probably use more just naturally as you're going through this, but think about specifically which 2 would work the best. For me, I'm thinking of using saran wraps for the top here to create texture, just kind of emphasize that little bit of texture a bit more. And then the gradient of color going from the shade into the hue, which means that lighter orange color here into the darker brown tone or shade of it. Getting started, just like before, work in light layers. So look at what your lightest color is, so this lightest orange, and that's what I'm gonna work with first as my base coat. So I'm just gonna grab a light orange color that is similar to this lightest tone and add that over everything. So I'm just gonna make sure I have a good amount of water and get this light color added into my background. So always important to work in layers when you can. Let specific areas dry before you come back to them to add your next layer or coating. You can always add darker layers, but you cannot lighten layers. So start as light as possible so that you don't have to worry about messing up or going back and trying to match colors that you have. So now I have my first base coat, and I'm gonna start to build in some of those darker browns or darker tones into it. So I'm gonna grab some brown over here, and while this is still wet, I'm gonna try to create a gradient. So I'm kind of ignoring the overlap at this point. I'm trying to fade from this brown into that lighter orange tone. So that faded nicely since it was still wet, so that's the wet on wet technique. And then I'm gonna grab some of the brown over here and do the same thing, kind of ignoring that overlap because this is helping to create our X-ray effect. Building in layers is going to really show and make that more obvious as you're working, that you have those transparent areas that are overlapping a little bit more. So now I'm gonna bring in some red tones. There are some red tints in these sections, and I don't want it to be too dark, so I'm gonna try to water this down just a little bit and kind of bleed that into the orange. So if the orange is starting to dry, I can kind of bring that back and mix and layer that a little bit more. So I'm gonna add some more water into this and try to really mix that red into the background. Bring in a little bit more of the brown and fade that into the colors that I have here. Now, as we're working too, you can see that that brown color does have some texture on it. So I could take either black or a darker brown and almost do a dry brush technique with just individual brush strokes. So I'm gonna bring this darker brown color down from the top, just following the curve of the acorn and adding that as kind of my top layer. I'm gonna bring some black into this left side where it's the darkest for my shade. And I'm just using kind of thin strokes for that texture of the black, feathering it out a little bit to soften it so it's not super harsh. Blending that in with what I had. Bringing a little bit more of the dark brown with a hint of black to make that texture stand out. All right, so now I have the base of that first acorn filled in. Now I can go back over it in this area here, filling that in. So I'm gonna bring in, like I did before, a little bit of the red up in this corner. Feather that down. So this is kind of pulling my color down so that it's not super red. And just continuing to add a little bit of the water to it to dilute the color. And then I'm gonna kind of ignore what I have here, just overlapping it and bringing in a little bit more of the brown on the left to darken this side. And fade that into the orange and the red. So I'm gonna grab a little bit more of my orange color, bring that in on top to mix with the red so it's not as vivid of a red. So I'm always mixing and layering my colors. Now I'm gonna bring in some of the black on the left, and same thing, try to use more of a dry brush technique. So you could either let this dry if you want to have more solid edges, or if you want it to be smooth and kind of fade a little bit more, then I would add it while it's still wet so you can see some of that texture. So again, this is kind of like a dry brush technique, and I'm just adding it right on top of what I had. So now I have that kind of see-through effect. I'm gonna make sure that my two edges are a little bit more solid. So I'm gonna bring in a black mixed with brown, kind of overlap this edge a little bit more so it's more of that solid line. And then same thing over here, making this edge a little bit darker. So now you can really see that transparent effect with those lines overlapping. And I'm gonna feather those out so they're not super harsh edges while my background's still wet. All right, and then moving on, I have just the tops here that I want to add the texture to. So I'm gonna start with an orange background, and I do not want this to dry before I can add my saran wrap, so I'm making sure there's plenty of water. And then I'm gonna add orange over to this one, making sure that there's plenty of water added. And then I'm gonna add a layer of brown. So I have my brown on top. And then add my brown on top over here. I might do one more layer of the orange on top of this brown since that did become a pretty dark color. And then I'm gonna take my saran wrap, press it down, and we'll let that dry. So I took the saran wrap off of the tops here. With watercolor paper, the saran wrap technique will work a lot better. But think about what you want to go over top of this with in order to refine and bring out details. So I'm just going to use the watercolor to detail this one. But if you liked the first one where we did with the flower Sharpies, consider using that. Or you could do pencil, charcoal, really anything is going to help to bring in some detail. So think about what would be an interesting texture or design for your detail. So with this, I'm just going to start bringing in a little bit of the texture. So I'm using black and just trying to draw some of those lines and edges where there's texture here. So I'm just adding my lines going in different directions. And I'm working with the black, so every once in a while I'm gonna get just a little bit more. Making sure to kind of curve up from the bottom here. And then bring in some of those smaller details. So you can see a little bit of that detail at the top. I'm going to outline the bottom here, make it darker, and then work with the other top of the acorn. So over here, same thing, I'm gonna get that darker color underneath, and then start to bring up some of my lines from the bottom and draw some texture into it. I'm just kind of adding the texture going in different directions and overlapping my marks. And then from here, if there's anywhere else that needs more detail, you can always go back and add it so you can kind of refine or touch up specific areas.